Okay, everybody. It looks like our guest speaker has joined us. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. My name is Terry Ann Palo, and I'm a regional planner with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. And we're kicking off our Regional Resiliency Speaker Series that we started last year. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the funding that made this speaker series possible. This event is supported by the sorry, my phone's ringing. This event is supported by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Resilience Florida program, which is dedicated to enhancing the state's resilience to flooding and sea level rise. The Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, as the regional resilience entity, plays a key role in coordinating these efforts, providing technical assistance and collaborating across counties and municipalities to develop strategies for mitigating the impacts of climate change. We're incredibly grateful for their support in fostering this important conversation. Just a quick overview about the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. We were established in 1976, and it's the only regional forum where elected and appointed leaders from Indian River, St. Lucie, Martin, and Palm Beach counties come together to address complex regional issues. This year, we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary, and we have unveiled a new commemorative logo to mark the milestone. The 50th anniversary logo features patriotic colors in honor of the United States semi-quincentennial and a subtle 1970s inspired font paying tribute to the decade in which we were founded. TCRPC develops strategic solutions and builds consensus around key goals in areas such as urban design, economic development, transportation, emergency preparedness, and natural resources, comprising 19 local elected officials and 9 gubernatorial appointees. TCRPC plays a vital role in shaping the future of the Treasure Coast through collaborative planning and coordinated action. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Erin Deady, president of Erin L. Deady, PA, a firm she founded in 2011 that specializes in sustainability, climate, environmental, land use, and water law. She works with local governments, special districts, private sector, agriculture, and tribal clients on climate planning, co-development, and complex land use and environmental matters. Erin was also part of the team that authored the St. Lucie Regional Resilience Plan, helping advance the coordinated climate adaptation efforts in our region. Ms. Deady previously served as environmental counsel to Audubon of Florida and has worked with the Village of Wellington, Broward County, and the South Florida Water Management District. She is a licensed Florida attorney, a certified land planner, and a LEED accredited professional. And I'll stop sharing now. Yeah, Erin, your audio doesn't seem to be working right now. Erin, if you're also having problem with your microphone, you can just call in using your cell phone. Stephanie has pasted the information in the chat.
About now, can you hear me now?
Perfect, loud and clear.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about the hiccup there. So I'm going to present to you to generally figure out ways to integrate the outcomes of vulnerability and resiliency work through planning efforts in Florida into comprehensive plans and codes. I'm going to work through some local case studies, but also some statewide case studies where we talk about certain policies and how they may be modified to incorporate these outcomes into vulnerability work overall. Okay, start with a little refresher for the planners in the room and make the case that because we have both long-term planning, growth planning, strategic policy framework documents in our comprehensive plan, in our short-term day-to-day decisions, in our code of ordinances, it would make sense that if we are doing resiliency planning, we would want to include these types of planning concepts into both those long-term and short-term policy frameworks so we can make our decisions on land development, infrastructure, private property development in a way that's better informed by both current and future flood risk. And that's the point of what we do in our work with local governments to incorporate resiliency planning into comprehensive plans and codes. And the reason we talk about it in both types of policy frameworks is so that we are dealing with that both long-term and day-to-day decision-making as the planning community overall. So Florida has some key components legislatively of how we would potentially do this, and it's evolved over time. The key components are in 2011 when we got adaptation action areas, which are an optional designation for local governments in the coastal element of the comprehensive plan to take a deeper look into certain areas or prioritize for funding areas that may be impacted by different types of flood risk. In 2015, we got the Peril of Flood legislation, which requires 6 different components to be included into the redevelopment component of coastal comprehensive plans. And we have a statutory framework for what those 6 key components are. But other components of our state law have also evolved to include these concepts. For instance, the sea level impact projection studies that are required for any capital projects that involve state funding. You have to model and evaluate how that project will perform with regard to various types of flood risk, including sea level rise. And then the biggie is the Always Ready legislation in the Resilient Florida program, which was enacted in 2021, but has had statutory modifications every single year since its enactment. And then we also got Senate Bill 180 last year, which put some limitations on the scope of comprehensive planning for local governments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well through a resiliency lens towards the end of the presentation. So a lot of us know that Peril of Flood requirements, most local governments have already incorporated those into their comprehensive plans since it was enacted in 2015. Most local governments have gone through at least one year-based cycle where they would have to update their comprehensive plans for statutory compliance. And what I would tell local governments is, yes, there are 6 key components here, but you should consider Peril of Flood as a floor, not a ceiling. It does allow you to go further than this in terms of how you address these statutory components. And I always suggest doing that because the fact that you've had to do these Peril of Flood amendments provides an opportunity to have a discussion, not just about meeting current current flooding impacts, but future flooding impacts according to various modes of flooding, which is something that did not exist in state law, especially in our growth laws, before the enactment of the Peril of Flood legislation. So how is resiliency implicated in the overall planning world? Well, most local governments that are conducting vulnerability assessments right now are doing it primarily to position themselves for grant opportunities, because the way the Resilient Florida program works, you can be eligible for project implementation funding as long as your project is identified in a vulnerability assessment. So that is what drove local governments to really look at accessing these dollars. Plus, it's 100% grant funded element of the state, so there's no match required. So why not go after these grant dollars that can help you evaluate where you're vulnerable according to different types of flood risk? But what it can also do, if you take your resilience planning efforts further, is allow you to develop projects to address what that flood risk is coming out of your vulnerability assessment. So an adaptation plan may have crossover with, for instance, your capital planning process, or an update to your capital improvements element, where you may want to queue some of those adaptation projects that come out of your planning process. Another thing that it could potentially influence is how you adopt and address your level of service. For instance, drainage is always a flag where an adopted level of service for many local governments is a 25-year, 3-day storm event, but that does not include a component for how level of service for drainage may be impacted by tidal flooding. And that's a really important component of level of service, is, are you designing your infrastructure in a way that accounts for all of the different types of flood risk? Like, will your infrastructure operate in these tidal flooding conditions, which is really important. So I counsel local governments that maybe they want to look at those level of service commitments, because it's not about just addressing deficiencies or maintenance of infrastructure. It may be dealing with adaptation and relocation, especially in coastal high hazard areas where we're supposed to limit public expenditures of dollars within those areas. Guiding priorities for land acquisition. Obviously, we don't want to acquire lands that are going to be 100% submerged by saltwater in 5 to 10 years. So making sure that if you have factors in the conservation element of your comprehensive plan which drive your land acquisition priorities, future flood risk is part of those factors that you would evaluate to do that. On the flip side of that, land acquisition and land conservation and land maintenance is a nature-based solution to make sure that, you know, we are protecting those conservation and lands in a way that can give us a resilience benefit. So land acquisition and land management is a huge component that could be benefited by incorporating resiliency principles into those policies. Flexibility in development and design that allows or incentivizes above code, you know, making sure that people, if they're constructing new projects or building back, they are incorporating considerations that come out of a vulnerability assessment. And then obviously integrating all of these concepts into the comprehensive plan and code, and not just the coastal element of the comprehensive plan, but every element of the comprehensive plan where it makes sense to do so. So thinking more holistically about where resiliency comes up, most local governments in the capital improvements element of their comprehensive plan have a list of factors that help them develop their capital projects or prioritize their capital projects. And some of those factors should start incorporating principles of, we may not actually adapt all of our infrastructure. We may simply maintain some of our infrastructure because we may not be able to throw enough money at that infrastructure to actually adapt it. And let me provide an example of that. Road elevation in heavily developed areas where you have constrained right-of-way. One thing that we're learning in the Keys is we may not be able to elevate all of the roads to keep up with sea level rise in Mother Nature, because there just may not be enough right-of-way to do that. So we may be implementing a policy of do the best we can and move on, but not committing to actually adapting all of our infrastructure to keep up with these conditions. And that's the reality that we're seeing on the ground. I've already talked about, can we meet our level of service? Stormwater is one that I mentioned, but parks and open space is another one where we typically have a lot of our park and recreation and open space along waterfronts that may be impacted by current and future flood risk, which is a cost to maintain that green and park and recreation open space infrastructure over time. So is it practicable to commit to certain levels of service that include those waterfront areas that are going to cost us more money to be able to maintain over time? Another idea is potentially levels of service for flood risk on roads, not just an ABCD capacity, how many cars can we push down the road, but that ties into a drainage level of service as well. But managing that risk in terms of what are we going to maintain versus what we're actually going to adapt. Establishing policies on how the local government's going to plan its infrastructure overall. For instance, we may be adapting and relocating facilities in coastal high hazard areas or areas that are subject to flood risk. But if we are implementing new infrastructure, we should be doing it in a way that includes a design component to address tidal flooding or sea level rise. So we don't plan that infrastructure the way we planned it 20, 30, 40 years ago based on a period of record of rainfall in the past, and that's not what's actually happening now. For instance, lift stations or pump stations that may be subject to the Florida Building Code, but we're looking at a 100-year event, that may not be the right event. We may have to design to a higher standard than that, depending on where that infrastructure is located. Intergovernmental and also interdepartmental use of data in our decision making. You know, I'd like to think that there are some local governments that are really good about talking across departments, where the stormwater people, the public facilities people, the resiliency people, the planning people are saying, yeah, we need to react to this new data and make better decisions about not only current but future flood risk when we're implementing a project. So that's not only intergovernmental across agencies, but it's interdepartmental as well. That is an area that is ripe for policy making as well, as we are finishing these resiliency related planning efforts, making sure that we're actually using that data. And housing policies that can incentivize or require siting decisions that incorporate current and future flood risk into those ultimate decisions, so that we're not putting vulnerable populations into developments that, you know, are served by roads that may be inundated and people don't have cars, they rely on public transportation, and we may be impacting or we may have that infrastructure impacted in the future. Another thing that I've recently started to work on are policies related to services, where certain local governments may have library services or fire stations or public safety components to their comprehensive plan. And again, it's that interdepartmental, interagency collaboration where, you know, we may need to site a fire station in a location because we have density and population there, but we should be building that fire station such that we can, you know, service that population, and the roads leading to and from that fire station are developed in a way or are adapted in a way that we can provide service from that fire station. So those public and social services components of comprehensive plans can also benefit from incorporating some of the resiliency outcomes and vulnerability data that we are generating now. So some specific examples, and I've already provided a copy of my presentation to Treasure Coast, so you can utilize those slides in your thought process when updating your comprehensive plan. But objective, I did not label the actual objectives to protect the innocent in terms of policies that may exist, but County X shall establish and maintain urban levels of service, areas of service, and phasing of infrastructure. And, in the unincorporated coastal area, so I add there, to the extent practicable, considering current and future flood risk, because you may not be able to meet adopted levels of service in the way that you had adopted them 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they've remained unchanged. So introducing the concept that you may not be able to meet certain levels of service, especially urban levels of service, everywhere uniformly the same way. And that is an important conversation to start having, because many local governments don't even know if they're meeting their adopted levels of service, let alone committing to meeting them in the future unchecked. The next one there, policy X, in the absence of legal constraints on revenue projects and programs, projects shall be funded in order to meet criteria. And this is that policy that I was talking about that pretty much everybody has within the capital improvements element of their comp plan, where they say, we're going to correct deficiencies, we're going to deal with public safety issues, we're going to meet minimum levels of service. I would add another criteria there, managing for current and future flood risk, and increasing community resiliency. Somebody's talking there in the background. But the point is that you will include current and future flood risk in that calculation of how you are queuing your capital improvements projects. Most comprehensive plans do not have that language where they are dealing with current and future flood risk. That last policy shall not utilize public funds for infrastructure expansion or improvements in the coastal high hazard areas unless the funds are necessary to, there it is again, maintain urban levels of service, which you may not be able to do. So add there, to the extent practicable. But another concept is when we talk about adaptation, that may include relocation of facilities out of the coastal high hazard area if you can potentially do that. Now, some public facilities and infrastructure, you may not be able to do it, like lift stations, because you've got population and density there. They have to be served on some level. So that may be that you're hardening that infrastructure or that you're adapting that infrastructure. But it's not correcting a service deficiency, which is a lot of times what we have in our comprehensive plans. We're going to meet levels of service and we're going to correct service deficiencies. You may not be able to do that, and you may have to think about differently, what that is, and that may include expending money in the coastal high hazard area to relocate an asset out of the coastal high hazard area. So these examples are just places, and these are not in the coastal element of your comprehensive plan. Generally, these policies are found in the capital improvements element of the comprehensive plan, which underscores, my advice to people is to not just be looking at the coastal element of the comprehensive plan, but be looking at all of the elements of the comprehensive plan. Another policy, the county shall, and of course, obviously this is one within the Southeast Florida corridor because they utilize the unified sea level rise projections for the compact, but adding language there, this language says we're going to evaluate, we're going to use those sea level rise projections when evaluating, planning, and designing public facility and infrastructure projects. And again, the new language underscores consideration of whether or not those levels of service can be met. And adaptation strategies may include maintenance only if it's not economically or physically feasible to adapt that infrastructure. Again, we're going to do the best we can, but we can't guarantee that we will be able to provide that same level of service and keep that infrastructure out of the levels that it will be impacted by sea level rise. The second policy there, the city shall require in rehabilitation and replacement projects, adding their resilient materials, providing educational materials, encouraging above code behavior in replacement strategies. And then the last policy there, City X will provide a public facility, will not provide, this is an important concept, will not provide a public facility nor accept a dedication of a public facility that does not incorporate a component for managing current and future flood risks. Like, why would you let a developer build you a road that's going to be impacted by tidal flooding in 5 years? Like, that is just going to be a financial and legal burden to the community. So you would want to go through a thought process. Look, if we're going to get a dedication of infrastructure, we want to make sure that we're not going to have to spend the money to adapt that infrastructure because it was constructed based on an old thought process of how to design that infrastructure that doesn't include considering future flood risk. And that's a really important one because, great, we're not dealing with the concurrency situation. The developer is going to provide the infrastructure, but now it's a burden on the local government. And this is an unnamed city within the Treasure Coast region. So other policy considerations related to resiliency. So government sometimes acquires property, and sometimes the point of that, or they may be in a FEMA or related program where buying properties, taking down the structure and returning the property to its natural state in a way that it can deal with flood risk, or that it's just not something that is repetitive loss. Like, if the government owns that property, is that property going to be flooded, and is it going to create a mechanism for flooding within the community? So that's kind of a policy conundrum where, it's taken a risk off of the roll, so to speak, but it's created a new problem in terms of it being low elevation, and it could be a conduit for flooding. There is a difference between what local governments do to adapt its infrastructure versus what we're going to allow private property owners to do. And I can tell you, if a local government has addressed resiliency, climate adaptation within its comprehensive plan, very few comprehensive plans make that distinction between public adaptation, public facility adaptation, and what it's going to allow private property owners to do. I have even read some comprehensive plans that have policies that at the time were probably noble, but say, we are going to protect private property from flood risk. That is an absolute misnomer and not based on reality, because it's not the local government's obligation necessarily, legal or otherwise, to protect private properties from flood risk. So government is not going to go in, put fill on a property, elevate shorelines, and protect that property from sea level rise. And so some well-meaning intentioned policies could imply to the constituency that the government may be in that business when it is actually not. This next series of policies relate shoreline policy and fill. And this is something kind of working on this issue statewide, that the two go hand in hand. Like, for instance, there are some local governments that have said, I'm going to modify my seawall ordinance to require seawalls to be higher. And that is a first step that many local governments have taken. And I would say that that is absolutely only a first step, because there is a cascading effect with other types of policies within, in particular, a code. You know, because if you modify the shoreline and you require the shoreline to be higher, there's a relationship between shoreline and fill, and how much fill you're going to allow on the property, or how much fill you would require to be behind that shoreline structure, so that, you know, especially in a very open or wide area, like some areas in the Treasure Coast have a very wide swath of the intercoastal waterway where storm surge can push up and just topple down that seawall or that shoreline structure without something reinforcing it. And then when you get into fill policy, you start to scratch the surface with you know, impervious surface and on-site retention. And we don't necessarily want people putting a lot of fill on their property, because I guarantee most local governments, if they have adopted the model floodplain management ordinance from FEMA, have a policy already that says we don't want to put fill in floodplains. You know, so there's a policy rub between what we're going to allow private people to do in terms of adaptation on their properties versus existing policy where we may have discouraged filling in a floodplain area. So, you know, then there's the final piece, which is property owner to property owner impacts, which are absolutely going to happen unless we have clear policy on the books between what we're going to allow people to do in terms of adaptation of their property or not. For instance, are we going to put a component in place related to lot grading or fill, where we're going to limit people's ability to put in berms, retention walls, or say that you can only put fill to the level of your property to bring it up and make it, you know, more resilient to tidal or flood risk, but you can only do that with a certain relationship to the average elevation of the properties around you. So you don't put 10 feet of fill, I'm being overly sarcastic on purpose to demonstrate a point. You don't put 10 feet of fill on your property and your neighbors, you know, are at 2 feet NAVD, and you've got now, you know, this mountain effect. And, you know, without controlling that fill, it creates a property owner to property owner impact. So that is an important component that, you know, there's a lot more, you know, coming out of these vulnerability assessments and integrating this into our comprehensive plans and our codes than probably we originally thought. Some other policy case studies, for instance, right now, Monroe County has on the books a municipal service benefit unit, and it's the only one in the state of Florida that has this right now, to my knowledge, that will allow an MSBU to be levied to deal with road elevation for sea level rise and tidal flooding. They are evolving that program right now and considering some new ordinance language, but many local governments have MSBU language on the books, which allows the levy of a municipal service benefit unit to deal with drainage, but drainage is different than tidal flooding. Drainage deals with stormwater, which is rainfall-induced flooding. Tidal flooding is a completely different component. So from a legal perspective, if you want to look at that as an assessment funding mechanism for these types of tidal flooding projects, you should probably expand the scope of your MSBU or your MSTU language to allow for that different type of flooding. Lantana, the town of Lantana in Palm Beach County now has a stormwater and flooding improvement assessment program. The reason we did that is to address that issue that I just mentioned about rainfall-induced flooding. Local governments have the legal authority to assess for stormwater, but stormwater is rainfall. And if part of the assessment program that you want to initiate, because it will be those benefited properties that pay for those resilience and adaptation projects, if part of that is to deal with tidal flooding, you probably want to expand that assessment program beyond the traditional stormwater utility assessment. We talked a little bit about seawall heights. One thing that I would encourage people to do is if they are looking at these ordinances, they consider it more holistically in terms of shorelines and not just modifying seawall criteria. We want to encourage living shorelines. We want to encourage plantings and keep natural shorelines. That's the best strategy that we have, but in some instances it may not be enough. But we want an ordinance that's a little bit more comprehensive to deal with shorelines holistically rather than just seawalls. Broward County right now, they have regulation on the books to not just deal with current groundwater conditions, but what are future groundwater conditions in their development approval process. Pinellas County has a tailwater condition for stormwater to make sure that stormwater systems are designed in such a way that they deal with the reduced capacity and discharge capability of stormwater systems where tidal flooding or salt water is pushing up a discharge structure. So make sure that you're designing that system. City of St. Augustine recently adopted lot grading requirements to deal with that property owner to property owner issue that I talked about with Phil, making sure that people can't create that mountain effect and adversely impact their neighbors. And several jurisdictions will create resiliency or climate elements of their comprehensive plan, which I suggest is a very good planning and legal strategy, by the way, because Chapter 163 does not prescribe really what goes in an optional element of your comprehensive plan. The legal standard has got to be internally consistent with the other elements of the comp plan. So if you want to get really creative in terms of resiliency, the place to really put it to protect it is a separate optional element of the comprehensive plan. So turning now to St. Lucie County, they created or in the wind down stages of a regional resilience plan. That regional resilience plan is comprised of two different types of vulnerability assessments, one dealing with flooding hazards, one dealing with other hazards beyond flooding. The municipalities are included in that process. They have been in terms of the modeling, the evaluation, the compilation of the assets. And there are broad strategies that are included within that regional resilience plan, both from a project, well, not just both, but from a project development and prioritization standpoint to a policy component, to data exchange, to education and outreach. So those strategies are grouped into different themes. And we are in process now. We have created a uniform set of policies that local government jurisdictions can consider, where we literally reviewed all of the strategies coming out of the regional resilience plan and decided, you know, is this a strategy that would lend itself to a policy or an objective or a goal within a comprehensive plan? So we created that uniform set of policies, and I will tell you, we absolutely made the distinction in those uniform policies between public infrastructure adaptation and private property adaptation. The other thing that we are doing right now is reviewing the individual comprehensive plans and codes for each jurisdiction. And we are making suggestions for all of the elements of the comprehensive plan where it would be ripe to incorporate. Can everybody still hear me?
Yeah, but the
okay, great.
Sharing.
Yeah, something just changed on my screen, but the sharing went away.
Yeah, you might want to start sharing.
Okay. Okay, hold on. Don't know why that happened, but here you go. Okay, should be back. And so now we are reviewing all the individual comprehensive plans and codes, certain elements of the codes, to look for opportunities where we could also incorporate those outcomes of the vulnerability assessment. The key code provisions we're looking at are floodplain management, infrastructure design, landscaping, I forget the other list, the entire list, but it's like certain components of the code, not the code overall. So just to kind of summarize the subject areas or the themes of those uniform policies, strengthening resilience with targeted strategies. This also includes an intergovernmental coordination, an agency collaboration piece of it, addressing vulnerabilities of infrastructure and assets, where we need further analysis, where we need more integrated or complex modeling, committing to integrating data into the capital planning process, resiliency components into public facilities, funding, and outreach. Objective number 3 is to address neighborhood vulnerability. So this is that component that deals with private sector adaptation, adapting how we build private property adaptation, and really focusing on a big component of education and outreach, because you know, the Florida Building Code and other codes don't necessarily incorporate future flood risk into what they require. So there are benefits, especially in a property where somebody's coming in, they're gonna, you know, buy the property for the location, they're gonna take down and rebuild the structure, you know, ways that we can incentivize and educate homeowners to do that in above code. Don't know why this is not sharing. Let me share again here. This is very weird. And number 4 is addressing vulnerability of natural areas, shorelines, land protection, improving water quality as a co-benefit, all of those things that I mentioned previously. So how would Senate Bill 180 impact some of this work? I mean, so we know the more restrictive or burdensome language in Senate Bill 180. We also know that it limits the cumulative look-back period for substantial improvement, substantial damage, not more than a year. Quite frankly, this is, I think, one of the equally really important limitations of this legislation. Hopefully it will get resolved in the Senate Bill 840 that's moving, should that actually make it to the finish line. But the point is, it's that more restrictive and burdensome. And we're already seeing comprehensive plans being kicked back. I've read some of those letters back from Commerce that really don't give you a whole lot of guidance on what they deem may be more restrictive and burdensome, but it looks more restrictive and burdensome to them, so they're going to reject your plan. So I think there's some things that need to be ironed out. You know, with that piece of it, again, the more restrictive or burdensome language specific to certain disaster declarations, that goes all the way to October 1, 2027. Hopefully, you know, the Senate Bill 840 language actually reduces that to 2026. So by the time we're really moving, should that provision prevail and get enacted in the legislation, this piece of it goes away, but this restrictive and burdensome language is still left if it is not changed in that bill. So we've still got a ways to go on the Senate Bill 840 language, in my opinion. So how would Senate Bill 180 impact some of this resilience work? And my presentation went away again. Okay, there we go. You know, so for some local governments, they're already saying, look, I'm going to curtail what I'm going to adopt in my comprehensive plan, and they're doing what I would call self-regulating. The one thing that is important here is that no local government is required to weaken their comprehensive plan or their code related to Senate Bill 180. So we should kind of start philosophically there, that would probably not be a good thing to be entertaining right now, to lose the strength that you have in the comprehensive plan already. We do know that some of this stuff is being challenged. In my opinion, this conflicts with some of the encouragement that the state is doing to push local governments in the direction of doing this resiliency planning, because now we've tied one hand behind the local government's back and being able to implement those outcomes into comprehensive plans and codes. You know, it can have a chilling effect on some shoreline ordinances, fill policies and regulations, but in my opinion, we just need to be smarter about how we get those regulations enacted. I would note that the St. Augustine fill provisions or lock grading provisions were enacted last year after Senate Bill 180. You know, so there are things that can be done in regulations such as, you know, if you meet this criteria in this menu, we're going to administratively approve your permit, or we're going to administratively approve your project. That's not more restrictive and burdensome. That's incentivizing people, you know, to develop a project or something to a specific standard, and it makes your administrative burden easier. You know, so there are some techniques that you can use to deal with some of these Senate Bill 180 impacts. And how to respond, again, the key component there is nothing requires amendment of your comprehensive plan or code to take things out of it and weaken it. That's an important threshold. Engaging with lawmakers right now to help them understand what the impact of Senate Bill 180 is on the planning process. That's an important thing, especially while Senate Bill 840 is moving right now. I'm almost to the end of my presentation anyway. But Senate Bill 840 lacks a House companion and still needs work, in my opinion. And that's pretty much the last slide of my presentation, just my contact information, which pretty much anybody knows how to get in contact with me. But I'll stop there at this point. That's pretty much winding up my presentation anyway, and I can take any questions, or we can have any discussion. Hopefully that gives you some ideas and helps you consider how to address vulnerability and resiliency in your comprehensive plans and codes a little bit more holistically than maybe traditionally some people are doing it.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Any questions for her or discussion? Sharing personal experiences? Okay, I guess you did a fantastic job presenting, Erin. No one has any.
Well, if anybody has any follow-up, you know, I'm always looking for case studies and new ideas about how to incorporate this stuff into comprehensive plans. I'm literally reviewing about 10 right now, so there's always a new idea and a new way to potentially incorporate this stuff into the comp plans. But I really feel like the sleeper issue that a lot of people probably don't think about is the capital improvements element. So yes, the presentation can be shared with attendees. The Treasure Coast has a copy of it, so please reach out to them and feel free to utilize it and follow up with me however you need to.
Yep, as Erin mentioned, I'll be issuing out the presentation and a copy of the recording. Just some quick announcements before we adjourn. The next FDEP Quarterly Resilience Forum is next Wednesday, and below I've outlined their agenda on docket. And then just to save the date, I know it's outside of our region, but Broward County will be having a Resilient Broward event on the economic strategies and solutions for our future. It's on February 26th in Fort Lauderdale. And then just a grant opportunity, the AARP Community Challenge Grant. It's currently open and the deadline is March 4th. I've seen some interesting resilience projects that some organizations or local governments have done in that award. So check that out. Another grant opportunity is the Climate Smart Communities Initiative Grant. I know that the city of Boynton Beach was actually awarded this last year for the development of their urban heat resiliency strategy plan. South Florida Water Manager District Resiliency Coordination Forum, Wednesday, March 25th. And then lastly, please save the date for our next speaker series on March 26th at 2 p.m. We'll be discussing the CDBG mitigation plan that the regional planning councils did, and also discussing the small area plans that we've done for that project. It'll be Tara McHugh, the Executive Director of the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, and our own Jessica Seymour, the Principal Planner here. And with that, thank you everyone for attending.